haven't been exposed to it. We're excited about getting that into the community. Okay, Bruce.
All right.
You're on.
You guys don't belabor things at all. It's like, just go. Here's Bruce, go.
They don't want to hear us.
All right, well, that's not normal. You guys are not normal. Just as I get started, a little bit of background. I have been speaking and teaching on the scientific evidence for creation for over 30 years. Came out of college with my degree as chemical engineering. I worked for 27 years at Dow Chemical as a research leader, research scientist, developing new products. So I have used science and the scientific method all my life. I left my job at age 49, had developed 17 patents for new products, made lots of money for the company, walked away while I still had 3 children in college, which is nuts. That's when you're supposed to be making the most money you've ever made and saving toward retirement. So you're listening to a crazy person tonight. But it just felt like inventing or developing some new improvement for a product that's going to sell versus trying to make a difference with a society that is morally sliding downhill like crazy. One just seemed way more important than the other. And God's Word is a foundation for truth, morality, history, science, government. Everything it speaks upon, if we apply what it says in a clear, straightforward way, things just work better. I mean, how could society not work better if we didn't lie to each other, and we didn't steal from each other, we didn't covet stuff from everybody, and we didn't murder each other? Society would work so much better, and on and on and on. And the foundation of destroying the trust in God's Word has been the foundation of assuming it's wrong from the very beginning. And that's what is happening all around us. So we're going to look at that. And one of the books I wrote, after I left about 17 years ago from Dow, I spent my first 2 books, because I've been writing and studying the evidence for creation from a scientific perspective for the 15 years before that, speaking on the weekend and working all week, almost like having 2 jobs. And I thought, I need to write a really neat book on what are the best evidences for a biblical creation viewpoint. Where did everything come from? Why do humans exist? Why does life exist? Why does the universe exist? And the science that supports it. And I called it Censored Science, because a lot of what you're going to hear tonight, school kids will never get to hear. 95% of Americans go through the public education system, and they will never get to hear this perspective. Only a church that's willing to bring a seminar like this along. Even most churches and sermons, they never talk about geology or science or genetics or biology. It's just ignored. So only one viewpoint is out there for the most part. Now, you've all heard the expression, the elephant in the living room. How can you ignore something so monstrous as an elephant that's sitting in your living room? And that's what's going on in the scientific community. And I'll explain how and why as we move along. But we're going to start because I don't shy away from saying my model for understanding history, for understanding science, for interpreting the data and observation comes from the framework which God's Word gives us. Because I would assume, I came out of college as an agnostic, a long personal story, but I eventually gave my life to the Lord and realized a lot of what I had been told was absolutely wrong about the various areas of science. It couldn't even possibly be true, but it's still taught as if it's true. So you'll see, I'm going to use a few Bible verses as we go along. And I hope there's some here that are like theistic evolutionists or creationists or believe God used evolution or are wondering or agnostic or not. It's great. So I'm not here to ridicule or argue, just to present a viewpoint you may not have heard. But there's a verse in the Bible that I like to call the Great Commission in the Old Testament. And Jesus' last words were to go into all the world and testify to the truth, to who he was and what he had done, okay? But in the Old Testament, there's this command. It's Psalms 145:4, and it says, our primary job as those who believe And it is a faith. The belief in creation, the belief in God, it is a faith. But it's not a faith based on no information and no supporting evidence. Okay? It's not a blind faith, but it's still faith, because you can't prove God's existence in a scientific laboratory. You can't repeat anything that's happened in the past in experiments. But you can look at the world around us and see, does it all fit and make sense? So the command is that one generation shall praise God's works to the next. They shall declare his mighty acts. So personally, the most mighty act of God is that he would take someone who is sinful, selfish, absolutely self-centered, wanting nothing to do with God or holiness, and save them if they're willing to just repent and admit they can't do it themselves. If you don't do that, you don't need a Savior. Why? So how can God save someone who doesn't even need a Savior? But he will. He died in our place for our sins. That's the most mightiest act of all, on a personal basis. But there are these other enormous mighty acts of God. The first being the creation of everything, all time, space, matter, energy, all forms of life, fully formed, fully functional. Not as a gradual process, not as chemicals coming alive. It's never presented that way. And a God who could write the DNA code, a God who could make the universe out of nothing from his spoken word, and a God who would make a human being capable of fellowshipping with him, logically ought to be a God who could communicate to us in a clear, straightforward way. And that's exactly what he's done in the very first 11 chapters of the Bible. It's straightforward. It's crystal clear what God is telling us. It's just up to us, in the freedom he's given us, created in his image. God has freedom to do what he wants, and he made us with that same freedom. We can choose to believe the truth, or we can choose to reject the truth. It's our choice. But he ought to be able to communicate in a clear way, and it's exactly what he's done, where creation came from. He talks about where death comes from. Okay, we'll talk about contrast the two viewpoints in a moment, but this is the biblical viewpoint. Death is here because we spit in God's face. We said, we don't want you to make the rules, we want to make the rules. In essence, we don't want you to be God, we want to be God. And because God is totally holy, he has to be totally just. And he knows sin inside of us will never stop. It will grow and corrupt and destroy, to the point all of human society is filled with murder and bloodshed and thieving and slavery and hoarding and destroying and lying and cheating. It'll just wipe out society, and he knows it has to be stopped. And he brought death into creation so we wouldn't live forever in that condition. And he brought not death, we would have lived forever, but we would have lived forever totally separated from him and under his judgment. So even death is an act of mercy on God's part, because he already knew what he was going to do about it. He was going to come take that penalty upon himself later. And then the Bible talks more about a worldwide flood that covered every hill under heaven. And God, at the end of the flood, said he'll never send another flood upon the earth, but there's been thousands of floods. So this is talking about an event totally different than any other event that's ever happened. And if you leave it out, you're going to misinterpret the past, you're going to misinterpret geology, you're going to misinterpret the time frame of the past. Big event of God. And then people spread out, and tomorrow night I'm going to talk about the brilliance of mankind and show you how these different cultures fit into a biblical time frame since the flood. They all arose since the flood, so 4,500 years ago. The Chinese, the Incas, the Aztecs, the Egyptians, all of these ancient cultures were brilliant. And they arose almost instantaneously, not 10,000, not 20,000, but about 4,500 years ago. And the greatest event is that when the creator of the entire universe would become a human being. Think about that. Why? To die in our place for our sins while we're still sinners. He died for us. So those are the mighty acts of God. That's the biblical framework in which to interpret biology, cosmology, geology, history, anthropology, government, human interactions, why death and disease exist. It's all wrapped up in those mighty events of God. If we did nothing but teach those in our schools, in our colleges, in our museums, it would change this nation like nothing could else ever would.
That's true.
It would change everything if we just, as Christians, the small minority in our country, verbalized that these are true. And every time they're contradicted, show people why it's wrong what they believe. See, we can't just say, trust the Bible. We have to show them why it's true in the culture we live in. That's the value of evenings and teachings like this. So what's the alternative if all this is wrong? It's all fantasy. It's all just religious dogma and not reality. You've got to come up with some other viewpoint, some other explanation for everything, because you've rejected the truth. And this is what the world does. It's that world's perspective, and it's only developed in the last 200 years. Prior to that, no one would the whole Western civilization would have thought, this is absurd that anyone would believe these things. The first being that there was an enormous explosion and nothing turned into all the stars, matter, energy, time, and space of the entire universe, starting with nothing. The Big Bang, when you really get into it with the highly technical Stephen Hawking's and the highly technical cosmologists, they all admit the Big Bang has to start with nothing. Because if they start with something, they have to explain where the something came from. They have to go back to God. So they all assume everything came from nothing. And then the Earth formed after, 10 billion years, just particles of dust came together to form the various planets around our sun. That's cosmic evolution, the Big Bang. The next thing that has to be explained is, where does life come from? So the presumption, based on God hasn't done it, the Bible's wrong, so we got to come up with another story, is that stars created all different kind of elements. Those elements came together to form complex chemicals. And on planets like the Earth and probably millions of other planets throughout the universe, chemicals came alive. And that started, early on they were saying, well, that was hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then it turned into millions of years ago, then it turned into billions of years ago. And now it's assumed here on Earth, they think it was now about 3 billion years ago that chemicals first came alive, chemical evolution. And the DNA code formed all by itself and so on. Well, then you finally got bacteria. And bacteria turned into more complex multicellular sea life, and that turned into fish and sponges and lobsters and clams and nautiloids. And then the fish kind of looked out and they looked onto shore and thought, well, man, it'd be really nice to live up there. So they turned their fins into legs and crawled up onto the shore and became amphibians. And the amphibians slowly developed as they became more useful with their legs. They turned into reptiles, and the reptiles got really big with dinosaurs. And the dinosaurs, where'd the birds come from? Well, the dinosaurs turned into birds. And that's taught as a fact in every museum, natural history museum in the country, in every textbook. It's a fact that dinosaurs turned into birds. And then, mammals are scurrying around, and somehow there was a big asteroid and it killed everything except the mammals, and that killed all the dinosaurs and some of the reptiles. And then those mammals got bigger and bigger brains and turned into monkeys, and the monkeys decided it'd be nice to brew beer and build cities. And wow, after 10 million years, they figured out if you put a seed in the ground, it grows into a plant. So they built farms and they turned into people. And that is biological evolution, supported by the fossils and supposedly geological evolution. Now, all that's taught is an absolute fact of science, okay? So you've got scientific fact, and you've got religious dogma. That's the way the world around us looks at these two viewpoints. So it's either the evolution perspective or the creation perspective. Now, neither one can be proven in a scientific laboratory. Yet both claim they can look at science and figure out which one is the truth. So if you think about those two perspectives, one says that natural processes made us and everything, including life in the universe and stars and planets. The other one says that we have a creator that made everything. Now, here's what anybody who really understands science will actually admit. Science is a tool. It can't determine truth. Okay? Now, it's a really powerful tool that looks how does creation operate, by what laws do things happen. And when you do something and you get the same result over and over again, then you can start to develop a confidence it's a law of how nature operates, so it's going to happen again. But if I try to use my hammer, which is my tool, as a screwdriver, is it going to work well? Absolutely not. You see, science works when you have two possibilities, or sometimes more, but honestly, with where everything came from, you only have two possibilities. There are no other. Either, if the universe is this box, either the box made itself and everything in the box made itself, or something outside the box made the box and everything that's in it. Those are the two possibilities. And by the way, those who think, oh, we'll solve the problem just by saying God used natural processes to make the box, they're still saying the box and everything in the box made itself. It's just a subset of evolution's true. It's still just the evolution idea. Now, if evolution is science, it should be looking for something that proves it's wrong. That's how science works. You can never know everything. So you can never know absolutely for sure that you have the right answer. And if you think you do and promote it as if it's absolute fact and absolute science, it's not science, it's a dogma. It's a religious dogma. If you're never willing to accept an experiment that will show it's wrong. And that's what God has done. He has commanded us to take dominion over creation. That means study, understand, and control. That is science. So that we will know which of those two possibilities is the truth. And we're held accountable for it. God holds every human being accountable for knowing He exists. And it says that in Romans chapter 1. That it's by observing creation we will know God's very power and nature. And every human being is without excuse. That's straight out of Romans 11, or chapter 1, verse 9. So here's the best understanding of what is science and what isn't science. It has to pass the white swan test. What's the white swan test? Well, a man named PhD Dr. Karl Popper, P-O-P-P-E-R, didn't raise penguins, not that Popper. He was a science theorist. How does science work? And he came up with this example that people have used ever since. It is the idea that if something is scientific versus a religious belief, you've got to be able to show it's wrong. You've got to come up with some experiment, some test, some example of knowing it's not true. Because you can never know enough to know for sure it is true. Now, it's like this. Suppose my idea, a scientific hypothesis, is just an idea that I think might be true, and then I collect observations to find out is it true or not. Suppose my idea is that all swans on the entire earth are white. Okay, that's my hypothesis. Now, how do I know whether it's true or not? Well, I could go all over California with my notebook and do all sorts of observations on all sorts of ponds and lakes and spend like years, and suppose I only saw white swans. Have I now proven with thousands of observations that every swan on earth is white? Have I? No, I haven't. I haven't been everywhere. But suppose now I have email and Facebook and Twitter, friends who do that, other friends who do that, other friends, and I get back millions of observations from all over the entire planet, in all countries, all over the planet, and everybody writes back and says they've only seen white swans. Have I now proven, as a scientific fact, every swan on earth is white? I see people shaking their head, and you're right. I mean, maybe someone lied. Maybe you haven't been somewhere. Maybe there's a recessive gene that just shows up every now and then to create a white swan. See, I can't ever get enough information. How can I prove whether my belief, my scientific hypothesis, is right or wrong? If I find a black swan. So you understand? That's how science is supposed to work. Evolution is the opposite. It has been that way from the get-go. It is popular because it gives mankind bent on escaping accountability from God, the excuse to ignore and push God so far into the misty billions of years past that he's irrelevant in our lives today. And it destroys the accountability and the trust in God's word. Because if it doesn't mean what it says at the beginning, in 6 days, God created the heavens, the earth, and all that they contain. Couldn't be more crystal clear. Where do you start believing it? If Jesus didn't mean when asked about marriage, have you not read, at the beginning of creation, he made male and female human beings. Where's the billions of years? You got to start black magic markering versus cover to cover in God's word if it doesn't mean what it actually says. Huge theological issues. That's the biblical point. The scientific point is evolution has enormous problems. And only the things that seem to support the narrative that natural causes did everything are shown in the textbooks. Anything that contradicts it is just ignored. And I'm going to give you example after example of that. And we'll start with something I mentioned really quick in church this morning. It's like the students are only shown the white swans. They're only shown the evidence that agrees with the belief system that is needed to support evolution and naturalism. They're not shown the black swans. And that's what we're going to look at. So we'll start with the origin of the universe. The Big Bang is presented as an absolute fact throughout the physics and earth science curriculums. And here's an example. Here's Stephen Hawking. He's a very smart, incredibly intelligent, incredibly well-written man. He says the Big Bang is in agreement with all observational evidence that we have today. Okay, it explains everything according to Stephen Hawking. Well, except it's got a huge problem. It has to start by saying nothing turned into everything. Now, the most tested, the most observed, the most understood, the most universal law that undergirds all of science is the first law of thermodynamics. And it's applicable in biology, it's applicable in engineering, it's applicable in chemical development, it's applicable in physics. In every area of knowledge, matter and energy can never be destroyed and never be created. No scientist has ever created a single atom. You can make energy into matter and matter into energy, but you get an equivalent amount of both. So if you have two choices, the universe and everything in it made itself, or something outside the universe made the universe, the most tested, the totally never contradicted law of science says the universe could never have made itself. You see, when you ask the question, where did everything came from, creation has a cause and effect. Things exist because something greater and more powerful than the entire physical universe is the cause of it all. Now that requires faith, but it doesn't contradict observation of the world around us and the universe around us. Evolution totally denies what we know about science. And it has faith that it happened anyway. See, it's two faiths. One faith versus another faith. One faith agrees with scientific observation. The other faith relies on the faith that maybe we can someday figure out why our observations aren't true. And they literally believe the first law must not have been in operation at the beginning, and nothing just turned into everything. There's no evidence for that. There's no reproducibility. That's the state of the world we live in. See, that's the black swan. We can know it's not true, and God holds us accountable for knowing it's not true. Now, I'm going to stay with this whole where did the universe come from subject for a second, because this one's even more stunning to me. The origin of stars. Stars are said to be forming throughout the universe in star nurseries. I'm going to show a little montage of National Geographic did a special on where did all the stars in the universe come from. Stephen Hawking did a special that ran on TV and was influenced and is shown in high schools. And then the Cosmos, Carl Sagan first did a series in the 1980s, and then it was reproduced in the 2010s. And it's like a 6-part, multi-million-dollar presentation of how evolution's a fact that explains everything. And they all talk about where did stars come from? Now, this is one of the things we know. We know how stars operate. It's a big ball of hydrogen gas, and there's so much mass there that the gravitational forces at the center of the star are forcing hydrogen to fuse together in hydrogen fusion. It's a hydrogen bomb in a controlled system where it releases enormous amounts of energy and light as it transfers matter into energy. And that's what makes life here on Earth possible. But it's still burning itself up. But it's incredibly efficient. Like you set a log on fire, and in a few hours it's all burned up and it's turned into water and ash and CO2. But a star is turning hydrogen into energy and light, various forms of electromagnetic energy. But it's burning itself up. And we know how long it's going to take. And almost no stars in the universe could be 15 billion years old. Most of them would have burnt themselves up. They'd be gone. All the energy, they reach the point where they collapse or explode or disappear. And yet these stars are still there. We still see trillions upon trillions of stars and galaxies. So if they're burning themselves up and they can't be as old as they say we need the universe to be to explain how big it is by natural processes, why are those stars still there? Big conundrum. Well, the solution is stars must be continually remaking themselves. Well, how does a star make itself? Well, what's taught as a fact, nobody's ever been there to see a star form, is that big gas clouds of hydrogen, gravity, pulls things together, and they just collapse tighter and tighter and tighter until nuclear fusion bursts out and a new star forms. And it's happening all over the universe, even as we sit here. And even after I became a Christian, even after I started teaching about creation for 10 years, I heard it over and over. I just, well, it must be true. It's kind of cool how God's done that. Until I learned the facts. And I realized, oh my goodness, I've even been deceived about that. Now, let me show you what the problem is. This is like the evolution of stars. Big gas clouds called protostars collapse, 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 and eventually turn into big blue stars. Little clouds turn into yellow stars. Smaller clouds turn into brown and red stars. And then they burn themselves up and eventually turn into quasars and pulsars, or collapse and turn into black holes. All this cool stuff out there. And just like the diversity of life here on Earth, there's an enormous diversity of stuff out there in the universe, and it really is fascinating. And by the way, I love what King David said in one of the Psalms. The heavens declare what? The glory of God. If the universe was like as big as our solar system, how could we get a picture of God's magnificent creativity and power? But they're enormous, and they're an enormous variety. Now, I want to take time and show a little montage I put together of those three specials talking about all of the experts of the world explaining where do stars come from. Because I think it's really important for you to understand the scientific community circles its wagons, and they only allow one viewpoint to be told. And the experts, even when they know better, they still talk about the narrative, the party line. Here's how stars form. And by the way, I didn't get the quote up there because I was pieced together some different presentations for tonight. But Stephen Hawking's, in one of his books where he said, the Big Bang explains everything, 2 or 3 chapters later he says, well, we still have trouble explaining star formation. But he still thinks it happened. Watch this little montage.
13.5 billion years ago, the universe was mostly hydrogen gas, with gravity doing what gravity does, which is to slowly pull it into vast clouds. We need to imagine squishing this hydrogen together, just as gravity does in space. As the hydrogen compacts, the atoms of gas start bouncing off each other, and the temperature begins to rise. We have created a miniature star.
Our entire universe emerged from a point smaller than a single atom. Space itself exploded in a cosmic fire, launching the expansion of the universe and giving birth to all the energy and all the matter we know today. Gravity was pulling together clumps of gas and heating them until the first stars burst into light. Hundreds of billions of suns. See those lights flashing like paparazzi? Each one is a supernova, the blazing death of a giant star. Stars die or born in places like this one, a stellar nursery. They condense like raindrops from giant clouds of gas and dust. They get so hot that the nuclei of the atoms fuse together deep within them to make the oxygen we breathe. The carbon in our muscles, the calcium in our bones, iron in our blood. All was cooked in the fiery hearts of long vanished stars. You, me, everyone. We are made of star stuff.
By observing nebulas at different stages in their evolution, the story of a star's birth begins to emerge. It all starts inside a cold, dark cloud of dust and hydrogen gas, where a quiet tug of war begins. The cloud wants to dissipate, like smoke in the air, but gravity wants to pull it together.
Gravity wins, and the material crunches down into a disk that is the beginning of becoming a star.
As gravity pulls more and more gas towards the center of the disk, it gets denser and denser and hotter and hotter. Until finally, at 18 million degrees, a miraculous transformation takes place. Hydrogen atoms fuse together to form helium, and with a burst of nuclear energy, a star begins to shine.
The amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They've created the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today.
Now, that last little sequence, that was Carl Strauss, a PhD cosmologist, goes from university to university. That room was probably filled with 500 freshman college students. Forget Jesus, the stars died so you could be here today. And you notice how glitzy, how beautifully, how authoritative those films were? These are the world's trusted experts, National Geographic, explaining how it's all true. And here's what is totally ignored. The universal gas law. Okay? Now, gravity does pull things together, large objects, even gas. But there's a way more powerful law at work. The universal gas law says gas always moves from high pressure out to low pressure. If left unrestrained to do what gas will do, it always spreads out. It will never, ever, in any experiment, in any observation, in any situation, all by itself, gas will not just pack itself tighter and tighter and tighter together. Gravity is 1,000,000 times weaker than the force of atoms just bouncing off one another. In my discipline, chemical engineering, we've got an equation called PV equals nRT. And when you arrange it, as you pack gas tighter, the temperature goes up and the energy and force pushes things away. You can test it with a balloon. You put gas in a balloon and try to squeeze the molecules together, it's shoving back out. It will never pack itself together. And you can do this experiment. That's what science is about. There's high pressure gas in this can, low pressure gas in this room. Now, if all of those experts are right, when I open this valve, gravity might just start packing all that gas down into this can, and all the air and nitrogen in this room might start to disappear, and you're going to all asphyxiate yourself when I open the valve. So you might want to hold your breath as I count down. 3, Here comes 2, 1. Which way does the gas go? Out. Nothing would work if that wasn't true. Internal combustion engines wouldn't work. Refrigeration wouldn't work. Everything we know about science would not work if that law was wrong. And there's never been an exception. And in space, there's no container. There's just a vacuum. And the molecules are millions of times further apart than they are in this can or this room. There's no way they would just pack themselves tighter and tighter and closer and closer. I mean, that one where you just put hydrogen gas in a stadium and let gravity pull it together and it bursts into a little star, your baloney detector ought to be going, beep, 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 baloney, baloney, baloney. If it was that easy to get nuclear fusion, we'd have unlimited power, and we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to make it happen, and we can't even get it to happen in a controlled way. We know it's not true. And no human being has ever photographed or observed outer space and taken a picture and 10 years later come back and taken another picture and there's a new star. Not a single example in any astronomy book. So we've never seen it happen, and the laws of science say it can't happen. So we know the truth. There's certain things God did that are outside the laws of science so we would know they were miracles. The formation of life, the formation of stars, the formation of time, space, matter, and energy. And he's told us he did it. And the laws of science show it couldn't have done itself. See, that's the black swan. That it's left out of the thinking of the world around us. Because that means God did it. That means we're accountable to that God. So the truth is obvious. We've got to show people this. Now I want to move on because man, the time flies when you're having fun. Again, an example, the simplest cell, I used an example yesterday, has thousands of parts. The very parts don't make themselves. See, these proteins line up these little Lego blocks that form these helix shapes that bend and fold to form proteins and polypeptides and cartilage and all sorts of things in our body. But in the end, the lining up of the Lego blocks determines the exact shape. Like that is one protein, and it has to be that shape or it doesn't work inside the cell. And they're incredibly microscopic. You need electron microscopes to see them. But we've gotten so good at science, we can observe what they actually look like. And we know that if you even change the order of a few of the Lego blocks, they don't form the right shape, and then they don't work, and then the cell can't live. And there's going to be thousands of different shapes inside of any given cell. But there's an even bigger problem. Even if all the components were present, like every little molecule you needed for life, and you put it in a container, and we've done this experiment billions of times every year where we get every chemical you need for life, and you put it in a container, and then you sit it, and like heat can pass in and out, and sometimes light can pass in and out, so it's got energy coming and going through the chemicals. And then you open it up to see, do you get a new form of life forming? Billions of times a year, the result's always the same. It's called canned food. Everything you need for life is in there. No alien creature ever crawls out of the can. Now let me show you why. Okay, and I do it with my magic can of evolution. It's an experiment I've done in every school for 20 years. Okay? Now what I do, I empty out my can, and there was like a little complex machine in the can. It's a pin that's made of many parts. Kind of like a cell is made of many parts, or a bacteria. So I'm going to take the parts apart. I've got a tip, which has been designed by intelligence to be the perfect shape to be the tip of a pin. I've got a little spring that's designed to be a spring. I've got an ink cartridge, which is made up of multiple parts. I've got a little rubber sleeve that goes on the top. I've got a button in the top, which is kind of trapped inside of a tube. So there's like 6 parts. And I put all the parts in the pin. Okay? Now I can add energy. I can shake it. Now you think it's going to turn back. All the parts are there. Just like all the canned food. All the chemicals are there. Is energy going to cause it to reform that complex structure? Y'all know the answer. Little kid knows the answer. But how about if I spin it? Or how about if I do it for 1,000,000 years? Well, the Big Bang was an explosion. Miller's experiment, where they made a few of the little Lego blocks called amino acids. That they didn't make all of them, they made the wrong kinds, they left out the stuff that would have destroyed them. That experiment is totally bogus. It shows life couldn't have happened, but it's presented as if it did. But it was always with energy. So I'm thinking, well, if I'm going to do an experiment, I got to try different things. So I'm going to add a lot of energy. It's a firecracker, okay? So I'm going to kind of balance my firecracker. And I've got a whole bunch, I love science, isn't this fun? Okay, here we go. Oh, okay. I hate it when this happens, but there's the reassembled pin. Now, this is the response I'll get with 1,000 kids in a school. They burst into spontaneous laughter. Now, why? Because it's so absurd. It is over-the-top ridiculous to believe the parts could have made themselves, first of all. But even if they're there, that just adding energy could get them to come together to form a complex little machine. And this is just 7 parts. The simplest bacteria has thousands of parts, and they're way more complex than a little bit of molded plastic. Every single bead has to be in the right place of the Lego block to form the right protein. So we laugh at it. Now think of what we have done as a nation. For generation after generation, we have brought the entire nation's school children through a system that shows them Miller's experiment and evolution and tells them that early in the earth, life just formed itself. It's 1 billion times more absurd than what we all just laughed at. And here we are as adults that just allow the next generation to be told this lie. It can't be true. Every experiment ever done shows chemicals never come alive. And life is way more complex. And the statistics are like one with hundreds of thousands of zeros after it against the odds of 1 that these things could ever happen. Even one of the chemicals forming itself or the parts actually coming together. So we know it couldn't happen statistically. We know it couldn't happen experimentally. We know it couldn't happen with our gut because we laugh at something that isn't even as absurd as that. So why are we allowing the children to be deceived? And keeping our mouths shut while they're deceived. We know the truth. And just like they're wrong about star formation, they're wrong about life forming. And they're wrong about the ages of things. Chemical evolution is an impossibility. It's the black swan that's not seen by the students. So this is the equation. That somehow simple life formed, and that these things called mutations happen, which are just random changes to a programming code. DNA is like a computer code, but way more complex than any computer code any human being has ever developed. And then if all random changes happen to have a functioning purpose, some useful function, then that creature that had that random change will have an advantage. And if it happens over millions and billions of years, the creature can slowly transform into a creature that's completely different. And it's taught as a fact. And students are shown that animals adapt and bacteria adapt and things do change. So that's true, that's not deniable. But we know simple life couldn't have been made. And that's not grandpa, okay? But that's what students are told. It's a college textbook. This is the well-preserved skeleton of a Megastronodon. This is an accurate reconstruction of our earliest ancestor. Now that's laughable 100, 200 years ago. Today it's considered fact because students are told it over and over again. Well, simple life doesn't work. So let's look at the next part of the equation. Mutations don't provide the solution. A mutation's a random change. Ask any computer programmer that's developed with enormous amounts of effort a program that runs a computer a certain way to do a certain function. If you randomly change a few of the bits or bytes or just a few of the letters, what's it going to do to your program? It'll usually crash it. It'll never make it better. They know it. Okay? That's what a mutation is, a random change. Now, my best way of explaining this, and that's my goal, is to just explain things in a way you can talk about it. And that's what those books are full of. Examples of how to lead people toward the truth. Is a flash drive. Now, this lecture goes back 20 years to when the biggest, most powerful, really high-end, $100 each flash drives held an amazing 512 megabytes of information. Top of the line, baby. Now, I know the young people are just laughing at this, okay? It's like a grain of sand on a beach compared to what a flash drive will hold today. Well, I bought one of these, and I literally did pay $100 for it. And, you know, within a year, there's like gigabyte flash drives, and then 32 gig and 40, 64 gig, and a terabyte flash drives. But I'm cheap. I didn't want it to buy another high-priced flash drive, so I thought, I'll just add a mutation. So I drove a nail through my flash drive. That's a mutation. It's exactly what a mutation is. Cosmic ray from the sun, radiation, random mistake. As one generation has a baby, the next generation has a birth defect on its DNA code. How many mothers prayed, oh Lord, let my baby have a birth defect? We all know it's not going to improve things. It's the last thing you want. Now, you could do a research study and spend thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars and get a government grant and try to figure out, is there possibly a way where that nail might connect a couple circuits that haven't been connected, and somehow, in some small little way, improve it. And maybe that might happen. But it didn't for me, it didn't work any better, so then I added more mutations, and then I just kept adding more mutations. And by the way, here's my flash drive when I was done. It had lots and lots of mutations. It never did hold more data. And it won't, because mutations never add an increasing level of functioning information or improve the information content. They will destroy information, and occasionally that'll have a useful functioning purpose. But it's always a loss of information, every mutation. There's not a single example in any textbook of a mutational change that added a new level of increasing information content to that creature. Now here's an example that's always given, and there's lots more. There's blind fish and blind cave salamanders that have migrated into caves, found food that they could eat, and because there's total darkness, their eyes are actually a detriment. And because the brain uses about 30% of its functioning, calculating ability to interpret visual images, if those creatures don't have to do that, it frees up that brain to do other things. And you see that with blind people, by the way. They're incredibly good at hearing and senses and feeling and understanding without their vision, because their brain can now free it up to do that. So it's told to students, see, that mutation that caused blindness had a positive mutational effect, and the creature can actually function better. But did it add any information? Did it make it an improved creature? No, it was a loss of information, a loss of function. If you had a movie theater filled with 500 people, and the lights all went out all of a sudden, it was total darkness, and one of those people was blind, and someone yelled, "Fire!" Which of the 500 people could function the best? The one who was blind, because he was used to that. Nothing changed. He wouldn't panic. He would function better than the other 499. But is he an improved human being? No, in one very unique, very specific, very rare environment, it has an advantage. And that's used to justify the idea bacteria turned into a human being. Now, the data doesn't support it. It doesn't work. Mutations are always mistakes. You can't throw rocks at a black and white TV and turn it into a color TV. That's what has to happen. Okay, I'm going to jump past this, but it's the black swan. So that doesn't work. Mutations don't help. The big thing that made Charles Darwin famous was natural selection. And this is the idea that slow, gradual changes can change one creature and add features and change it into a very different kind of functioning creature. We're just going to look at one example, because again, you can't just say, the Bible's right, God made very different kind of creatures, which is what he tells us. Fish stay fish, birds stay birds, cows stay cows, people stay people. 10 times we're told that in the very first chapter of Genesis. Completely different body structures, supernaturally created, fully formed, fully functional. That's what we're told. And that's what is testified to by understanding creation. And we're going to look at this by looking at the leafhopper. Now, there's about 20,000 species. Now, that just means God put into the programming system of a leafhopper type creature the ability to have lots of variety. And it will adapt, and it will find different environments, and it will find different color camouflage that where it survives best. But all that information was already there to begin with. We got an enormous variety of dogs. They all came from a gray wolf. Genetically, you can show this. That's not evolution. That's the information God put into the dog kind, and we can either use human breeding or natural processes to allow long-haired dogs or short-haired dogs or different dogs of different shapes to survive better in different environments. And then they form a given breed. Well, with this creature, his hind legs are designed for jumping like no other creature. He's like the Olympic gold medal winning athlete of the insect kingdom on steroids. I mean, he jumps like crazy. When he takes off with this long levered back leg, the little one, the little nymph, which is an immature adult, he's not an adult yet, so he doesn't weigh very much, and his legs springing forward, he moves at 400 times the acceleration of gravity. Astronauts in their space capsule, when they're escaping their gravity, they only reach about 8 Gs. Jet pilots are in danger of blacking out at 10 Gs. This guy takes off at 400 G force. Now, this is how we test these folks to see, can the human body take this kind of acceleration? They put them in a centrifuge and spin them around faster and faster and faster to see are they going to black out as a good pilot or a good astronaut. I want to show you what 2 ladies in this instrument look like when they're moving at about 8 G-forces. That's what it looks like. They're moving forward so fast their faces are being shoved backwards, okay? That's just 8 times the acceleration of gravity. Our insect takes off at 400. Now here's the problem. When his little brain says jump, you know, he's walking along, dum, 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 and his brain says jump, there's a nerve signal that has to go down his back and it has to split, and then the information to jump has to go to the right leg and the left leg. Well, to move at essentially the speed of a bullet. When he jumps, he just disappears like a bullet coming out of a gun. That signal can't get to both legs at the same time as fast as that insect will respond. So statistically, it is guaranteed one of his legs is going to shove first. Is he going to go in a straight line? It's going to go sideways at the speed of a bullet. Wham! His head's going to hit the wall. His brains are going to go flying out. Dead leaf hopper. Well, this is a real mystery to scientists. He doesn't go sideways. He jumps in a straight line. But it shouldn't happen that way, because they know how fast everything should happen. So they started studying it. And deep inside of this leaf hopper, this is what they found. 2 perfectly formed gears. Now this isn't a machine shop. This is inside this little insect. The right leg's attached to one gear, the left leg's attached to another gear, and if one of those legs starts to move, it forces both legs to move in perfect unison. Isn't that cool? Now think about someone who's been trained, evolution's a fact, millions of years, billions of years, they're going to say, wow, that's really useful. Look what evolution created. And students will say, wow, that's really neat. What a neat thing nature did. But all they have to work with are little tiny changes. How did an insect with no gears turn into an insect with gears? Well, it's like maybe those insects had 2 little round things in it, and a mutation is like hitting it with a hammer. Oh, I just made a little nick. Hit it again, hit it again, hit it again. Bang, 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 bang. I made little nicks. So maybe I form a little fin. Now you've got an insect that's got a fin sticking out, grinding away at the inside of its body. It's going to die. Or maybe you've got a bunch of fins on this one and only 2 fins on that one. Its legs are going to lock up. Or maybe you've got fins sticking straight out, you've got other fins at an angle. It's going to lock up. And then you've got to have a gear that now has a connection to a muscle that's going to pull the gear forward. And it's going to be at the perfect spot, and then both gears have to have it. And then you've got to have a nerve signal that comes down and knows that that muscle is there, and it's got to have, the brain has to know what to tell the muscle to do that it didn't even know was there. If the muscle's missing, the nerve's missing, the connection's missing, the number of fins are missing, the angles of the fins are missing, if anything's there just a little bit, a step at a time, the insect's going to die. You see, unless it's all there, all at once, nothing could work. That one example should destroy anybody who's willing to admit what the truth is, that evolution works. The problem with small step changes being filtered by natural selection is it can't explain millions of features in the biological world. They're just assumed to have happened. And the word evolution's thrown at it, and students get just sucked into believing it, instead of thinking it through. We know it couldn't happen. It's the huge black swan. I'm going to jump past this because I want to get to some other stuff. Natural selection is not the answer. Detrimental genetic mistakes are building up much faster than anything could remove them. Every generation is a little worse than the generation before in our own bodies. Every skin cell, every muscle cell, every hair cell is a little worse than the one before it. And that's why we die. We mutate to death. Because every copy is a little worse than the one before it. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. Biological evolution is an impossibility. So natural selection doesn't work. And by the way, the time frame is all wrong. Why? Because of the worldwide flood. The flood would have ripped up everything and deposited the sedimentary rock layers of the earth recently and rapidly, filling them with billions of dead things. And the only way to make a fossil, something that has been turned to solid rock, is to take some living thing made of carbon. You got to bury it really deep, or oxygen just destroys it. You got to keep it buried deep enough that bacteria and fungus and algae and all sorts of things that are built to recycle the world don't destroy it. And then you have to have water filled with minerals percolating past those things that have been buried. Not just for an hour or a day, but for week after week and month after month. Mineral-filled water percolated down path through loose sediment filled with dead things. You do that in a laboratory and you can create fossils in a matter of months or years. It doesn't take millions of years. And the rock layers are filled with trillions of fossils. They didn't form over millions of years. They formed rapidly during Noah's flood. And there's all sorts of evidence for the rapid formation of the rock layers and the salt domes and the oil fields and the sedimentary layers of the earth. It's just ignored because we choose to believe it happens slowly and gradually over huge periods of time. Last subject. What about the ape skulls? And they look definitive in every textbook and every natural history museum. Here's a display from the Smithsonian Institution, one of the most trusted institutions in the United States. They show these skulls with really sloped foreheads and other skulls that are being more up and down foreheads, and then skulls that get more domed foreheads, and then finally human skulls and Neanderthal. And they can line them all up and they say, they're all there. This proves some sort of an apish creature has turned into human beings. And that's what students see. Now, what you don't hear is that there's a whole bunch of missing parts. Like this one right here, the only parts that are found are a few little pieces are in blue, and the rest of it's all pretend. And they distorted the scale. This skull's about 1/4 the size of that skull, but they show them all the same size in order to promote the narrative. And there's all sorts of interpretation and disagreement amongst the experts, and lots of similarity. You can kind of group them into very apish skulls and very human skulls. And there's a real big gap between the two. And we now know that if you take a group of humans and you put them in an isolated situation where there's a real food shortage, and they interbreed amongst themselves generation after generation after generation, their body and skull size decreases dramatically, as much as 50% or more, to conserve energy. It's a natural selection process. And their skulls become very distorted. It's called insular evolution. Things degenerate when they're inbred and there's a lack of nutrition. So there's a really high probability a lot of these skulls really were human skulls, but they're in the process of degenerating shortly after the flood, where they're isolated. It's a really rough situation on Earth history. So they're not apes in the process of turning to humans, they're humans degenerating because of environmental conditions and genetic conditions. Now let me show you how easy it is to just totally misinterpret things when all you have is a bunch of bones. And I do it with this. I've got 4 skulls up here, and suppose I'm a paleontologist, and I dig down in the rock layer and I find this skull. And I'm the first one to find it, so I get to name it like the Bruceosaurus, okay? And it's kind of cool, it's got big vicious teeth, so I assume it's a carnivore. And then I keep digging, and this was way down deep, and further up, which I assume is more recent, after millions of years, I find a skull that looks like this. Now, this one's much smaller, they're both full adults, but they have the same general shape. And I'm wondering, the 2 different species that were found in very different rock layers, how did this one turn into that one? And I think, well, maybe things were hard to find, food was hard to find, smaller animals had an advantage. Maybe there were lots of trees in the area, and if it was smaller, it could hide behind the trees better. So the same creature evolved and slowly changed because the smallness gave it advantage, and it turned into that. Well, then suppose I keep digging, and now I find this skull. Now look at that baby. He's getting a bigger brain, bigger domed forehead. His jaw is sticking way out. So maybe he's able to dig underneath roots and rocks and trees, and he can dig up grubs and stuff, and by having a long jaw, he can find other sources of food that these guys never thought of. And his brain's bigger and allows him to think better. And it evolved. It's higher up in the rock layers, so it turned into a different creature. Evolution is happening. But then I find the best one of all. I find, look at this guy's brain. It's like a human brain, big domed forehead. The proportion of his brain to his body is like 10 times more. He's such a small little creature, and he's got this huge brain. He must have been the Einstein of these kind of creatures. And he's way up high in the top of rock record, and his brain allows him to survive even though he's really small. See, I have used evolution to explain how all these creatures developed, when I've just found nothing but the bones. That's how it is presented in the textbooks. Show a story of how adaptation could have happened. And all we have are the bones. We don't have a movie. We don't have anybody seeing it happen. So it doesn't get contradicted. Now let me show you what those actually were. The first one was a gray wolf. Okay, that's a wolf skull. I had a friend that's a naturalist from Minnesota that sent me the skull with a certificate allowing me to have it. The second one is a fox. It's still the dog kind, just a variation. The information needed to make both was already in the original gray wolf. The third one is a bulldog. Okay, it's just another variation that was already in the gray wolf. The last one, it's not Einstein, it's a stupid little chihuahua. Okay? He's not smarter. He's probably dumber. As you inbreed, you eliminate all the variety and you end up with this little specific little breed of dog. But that's not evolution. All of the information to need all the dogs was already in the original dog. Evolution doesn't explain where that came from. They call these little changes microevolution, adaptation, convergent, divergent evolution. They're just variety that God put into a given form of life. It's the way better explanation. And this is where I end up. If the evidence for creation is so strong, why don't more people accept that evidence and reject evolution? The primary reason is that science itself has been defined to eliminate the consideration of God. Now, I'm going to quote Richard Dickinson. He's a prominent biochemist, evolutionist. He's a member of the elite National Academy of Science. This is how he says we've got to teach each generation. Science fundamentally is a game with only one overriding and defining rule. Let's see how far and to what extent we can explain the behavior of the physical material universe in terms of only physical material causes, never, ever, ever, ever talking about God or the supernatural. It's out of bounds. Can't consider it. See, science isn't looking for truth. Those scientists who have been indoctrinated in this way, not all scientists, but the majority. The majority of PhD scientists teaching in our university, 95% are atheists, because the system has filtered out others, and they get fired and they get released. Involving God in explanation constitutes a form of intellectual cheating, like a chess player perfectly capable of smashing an opponent's king to the floor, But this wouldn't make him the champion because the rules weren't followed. The rules say you can't consider God. Well, if God did what he said, that is the truth. So you can't consider the truth. That's what's going on all around us. Evolution is not promoted because of overwhelming evidence, and creation isn't rejected for lack of evidence. Biblical creation models ignored because scientists are trained to ignore it and would be accused of cheating if they accepted it. And here's a couple quotes. Dr. Scott Todd, this is when Kansas elected a school system that said our science textbooks and curriculum have to include the problems of evolution and teach the evidence for creation. The whole media, legal, intellectual system went ballistic. And this is one of the statements that was made during that in 1999. Even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis must be excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. See, that's what's going on, even more strongly today than 20 years ago. Richard Dawkins, the leading atheist of the day, he said during a presentation at the University of Washington, we don't need evidence, we know evolution is true. See, every once in a while, they slip up and explain, this is a dogma. We're not science versus science, we're two religious philosophies. And we really do have the truth and the evidence on our side. Okay, I'm going to skip past this, end with this, and I'm right at where I should stop, or a little bit past, but I want to take 5 minutes. And I want to show what the evidence for creation can do when it's allowed to be seen by students. And it's not the case here in the US. But I was asked to come to Fiji in 2015 the first time, worked with a missionary. I suggested if I bring one of these books and I print copies and I'm shipped to Fiji, and we're going to print 10,000, do you think I could get into the public schools and bring a science seminar and show them just what you got to see tonight and more in a 1 hour period? And he got really excited, and it got delayed a year, so in 2017 we sent 20,000 books. And it's inspired evidence. It's that soft cover book that many of you have. That's the one we sent. And the results were just astounding. We spoke at about 30 schools to 20,000 students over a 2-week period. So I'm going to show, since then, we've been to 6 different nations and we've spoken to 140,000 students and given away that many books to these students. And it's often the only book they own, other than the Bible. Lots of missionary work in these countries, so most of these students have Bibles, but they're sitting on the shelf as an archaic old religious book. And we're able to connect the two. We're connecting the Bible to reality using the public education system. So here's an assembly in Fiji with about 1,000 students. We got a big, powerful projector and about a 10-foot screen. Here's an assembly in the Philippines. A typical presentation, we show them how science works. Like I did tonight, it's just a tool. We show them the Bible is not just a book of religion, it gives a scientific model for understanding biology, geology, astronomy, and so on. We show them that the laws of science point toward creation. We show them the complexity of life means it could never make itself. We show them the rocks and the fossils are there because of a worldwide flood. And then we end with helping them understand how intelligent people can be so deceived when they never get to hear this kind of information. Show one of those videos like I showed in church the last couple times. So here's 2,500 students in a stadium in the Philippines. We've been to 320 schools, given 370 presentations to 140,000 kids on 13 trips to 6 nations. And sometimes we'll take a whole team from a church. We'll break up our presentation into parts. And it's a fun visual presentation. And here's the looks of the students as they're listening. When we're talking about geology, we bring in dinosaurs. We have a big T-Rex that comes running in. And it just breaks it up to make it interesting for the students. And here's their faces. We're using the education system to connect the Bible to reality. Isn't that phenomenal? We get to teach truth. We get to introduce the students to not just their creator, but then we tee it up. And we say, you've now seen all this evidence so you can know that you have a creator. That just random processes didn't make you. You have a purpose and meaning in life because the one who made it all made you. But that one also holds you accountable for obeying him. And there's a price to be paid for your disobedience. And then we bring in a local pastor or the missionary that then brings the gospel message to all these kids. 140,000 of them so far. And we're impacting an entire generation with biblical truth by starting with connecting everything else back to the Bible. Here's Fiji students in March of 2017. They're all holding up that Inspired Evidence book. Really, really happy to get it. Here is a picture of the salvation call. And you can feel this tangible desire to want what God had to offer as they're hearing about what he's done for us. You can see it in their faces. You can feel it in the room. It's just so special. Here's the next year we're back. And then we started printing full-color hardcover books because we wanted them to last for a decade and wanted them to be shared with friends and neighbors and the next generation. So now these kids have a full-color hardcover book. In the Philippines or in the Fiji, we get the permission of the Department of Education to go into every high school in the entire nation. And that's stunning. And only like less than 10 high schools that were run by Muslims wouldn't allow us in. A couple of Muslim high schools also allowed us in. The Hindu high schools allowed us in. The different high schools, they can have their own religious flavor as long as they carry the national curriculum. And the national curriculum is filled with evolution because it's printed by the United Nations in Great Britain. They're old English colonies. So we're coming in and wiping all that misinformation out and giving them actual evidence for biblical truth. Then we tried it in the Philippines, and we spoke to 30,000 students over 2 trips. Just packed in 2019. We went in the spring and we went again in the fall. And then we went back to Fiji in March of 2019. Then we went back to the Philippines in 2017 again. We tried Vanuatu, another island nation. Same impact. Enormous number of kids wanting salvation and being connected to the Bible. And that was the second trip to the Philippines. Back to Fiji, right before COVID hit. We got shut down. In March, COVID started. You know, in the Philippines, those poor kids, not one of them got to step back into a school for 2 years. The government was so scared they were going to die. And yet, there was almost no student in all of America that died under 19 that didn't already have a pre-existing respiratory problem. No students were going to die. And yet they totally shut down their education system. Such a travesty. So many lies that went on. In Peru, we went down in April, our first trip after COVID, we opened up things. You'll notice the students are still wearing masks in 2022, slowly disappearing as truth is coming through. But here's the hands going up for the salvation call at the end of the presentation. This year, we went to Jamaica. I love this picture. Look at these kids' faces. That's right after I pulled the pin out of the can. You have everything from stunned, absolute fear over here to absolute astonishment to total joy, all in the same picture. Love that shot. Robin, where are you? My wife took the best picture in 30 years of ministry. She captured that. And then we went to the Cook Islands in May and spoke to the only high school in the whole nation. There's only about 20,000 Cook Islands citizens, and most of the rest have went to New Zealand and other places to earn a better living. And we ultimately have given away about 5,000 books. So we've touched the entire nation as we spoke to that high school. Lots of other things happened. So this is what's going on. We're increasing the interest and the trust in God's Word. Their English comprehension improves because they're reading this book over and over and over again. It's short, interesting, and understandable. Their science in test scores increases because all of a sudden they're seeing they don't have to separate God from science. It's all connected. And they're more interested in science. And salvations are resulting. What a great way to do missions. And I'm going to skip this, but it's a student that wrote back from the Philippines that said he was confused by years. He was deceived. He didn't understand whether science was right or the Bible was right. He didn't understand comparative religions. He didn't know if atheism was right or the Big Bang. And us coming to the school just cleared away all the fog. And he knew now he could trust God's Word and trust God as being real and caring about him. And that's just one of who knows how many students. So put the resources to use. Most of them don't cost anything. These little videos, you go to my website, you can sign up and they come every couple weeks. The newsletters cost nothing. The books are filled with great information. And this flash drive, and we ran out of them, but anybody who doesn't have a flash drive, I want to end, and I know I went over, but we'll stop time for a few questions. I want you to see the quality of the information where I have 19 different 45-minute teachings, 19 sessions like you heard here tonight. Many of them ending with these videos showing how people can become so blinded. Filmed on location all over the United States. They took 2 months and $10,000 to produce each one, plus 60 little 2-minute videos, all of them on that flash drive. And I normally sell them for $40, but your churches just want you to have them for any donation. You don't have to pay that much, 10, 20, whatever, or nothing. So sign up on the list, and we'll get them to the church by next Sunday. And you can take them and put them to use, or you can contact the pastor and pick one up. So, but this is what they look like, the little videos. This is just a 50-second promo for the one on design. Does design show evolution? Does design show creation? In the case of life, all 5 criteria fit the fact there has to be an intelligent design behind it. With Mount Rushmore, only 3 of the criteria fit the idea that it was intelligently designed, and yet it's obvious it was intelligently designed. You look at this clock, it has many, many different components, all of them designed to work together and turn exactly as a pendulum swings as they ratchet forward to maintain time. Any form of life, even the most simple single-celled organism, is made up of multiple components that don't occur naturally. Let's say I shook this can for 1 billion years. This is going to be a very long class in science fun. Wait, if we don't make God's word that light before us, we will literally become blinded to the obvious when it's right in front of our faces. So, put all these resources to use, make a difference, put the truth in front of people. The truth is like putting a pebble in someone's shoe. They know it's the truth, and if they don't believe it because they've been trained to think otherwise, it's still irritating. It's still going to get them wondering, and it's still going to point them in the right direction. But you're going to make it fun and interesting and visual and relevant. And hopefully these sessions have helped you do just that. So now I went over, but hopefully we still have some time for questions. Any questions? Anything you're wondering? Any stuff you've seen? Yes?
How do they determine when they're looking at all of those skulls that those are all mature skulls?
By finding lots of them. Lots of them in the same layer, maybe the same vicinity, and they'll see little ones, and they'll see big ones, and they'll see aged ones with, you can see the signs of teeth wear and age and thickening skulls or whatever comes with age. And you can probably come to some pretty reasonable scientific observation conclusions based on lots of the same thing being found. So that was a story. I'm just making it up because, by the way, we don't normally find a skull. We normally find all sorts of pieces, especially with these supposed ape man things. Some of those skulls are found in like 80 fragmented pieces, and then they've got to put those pieces back together the way they think it used to be. And if they're trained, evolution's a fact, you're going to put them together in a way where it's more sloped. And it happens. And there's all sorts of controversy among the human paleontologists, anthropaleontologists, who look at the same set of bones. Some of them will say, no, it's clearly an ape. Other ones will say, no, it's a partial transition between an ape and a human. And they argue amongst themselves, but then they all circle their wagons when it's time to do a museum. And they'll just say, well, it's a proof that it really was partially human. So There's a lot of good books that have been written that show the controversy and the contradictions even amongst the experts in the field. It's not near as definitive as the students are led to believe.
Can you explain the fallacy of the carbon dating?
Yeah, but very briefly, number 6 of the rocks cry out, it's on the flash drive. Remember, whatever you can afford to throw at that. This is 25 hours of viewing for and I'm not asking her anything for it, HD quality stuff. Number 6 is about carbon dating. Number 12 is about radiometric dating. Carbon dating works like this. Our bodies are made out of carbon. Everything that's alive is made out of carbon. Where's the carbon come from? It comes from CO2. Plants, in this miraculous process called photosynthesis, take nothing but water and oxygen, and they transform, and CO2, which is oxygen's in CO2, and they transfer those two things into the very cellular structure of their bodies. Animals eat plants and other animals, and that's where they get their carbon. And all of our carbon comes from CO2 that was originally in the atmosphere, okay? The biggest sequoia tree is nothing but CO2 and water. That photosynthesis has turned into that tree. Now, in the atmosphere, the sun is putting out light, but it's also putting out gamma rays and X-rays and all sorts of nasty stuff. The Earth's magnetic field shields the Earth, and most of that gets deflected around the Earth, but some of it gets through. And when some of this high energy radiation hits the center of a nucleus of nitrogen, it blows it apart. You got a bunch of neutrons and protons floating around. They immediately recombine in a way that turns nitrogen into carbon. Okay? Instead of being an atomic weight of 14 in nitrogen, the recombination makes carbon-12 weigh 14 of an atomic weight. So it's an unstable form of carbon. Carbon ought to weigh like 12 with 12 cue balls. Carbon-14 weighs 14. It's got a couple extra cue balls, and it's not stable. But it's identical in every other way. That carbon combines with oxygen to form CO2, and we know the exact percentage. It's like 1 part of radioactive carbon-14 floating around in the atmosphere compared to 1 trillion parts of regular carbon floating around in the atmosphere. Plants can differentiate, so they take that same proportion to build their very cells. So the plants are partly radioactive, they're very cellular structure. Our bodies are partly radioactive, they're very cellular structure. And every 5,270 years, half of that radiocarbon will fly apart and disappear. And I'm going to round it off to 5,000. So let's just pretend that this represents the amount of carbon-14 in our bodies. So we die. A scientific fact, when you die, you stop eating, okay? Very testable and reproducible. When you die, you stop eating. So you stop taking in radioactive carbon, okay? While you're alive, it's disappearing as fast as it's coming back in. So at 5,000 years after you die, half of that radiocarbon has disappeared. 10,000 years go by, what's left? Half of that disappears. 15,000 years go by, half of it disappears. 20,000 years go by, we're down to this much of the original amount. Okay, now suppose a scientist goes and he digs up a mastodon that's been found in a glacier, or some poor Neanderthal hunter that lived after the flood when the Ice Age was raging and fell into the glacier, and they grab one of his hairs. They can put it into a mass spectrometer that can measure almost to the atom how many atoms of regular carbon, how many atoms of carbon-14 are left. And they find out there's only this much left. Okay? They're going to say, wow, to get that much carbon, it had to have divided 4 times. This guy must have lived 20,000 years ago. And it will be reported as an absolute fact of science. Whatever they measure, however much carbon-14 is left, that's how old that thing was. And it sounds really accurate. It sounds very logical. It's going to be presented to the students, and they're going to be convinced that things lived 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, whatever. Now, did that scientist measure time? No. He measured the amount of a chemical, and then he made assumptions. He assumed when that mastodon was alive, it started out with the same amount of carbon-14 that we have in our bodies today. and everything that's alive that is living today with the amount in the atmosphere has in their structure. That's your starting assumption. But guess what? If we could gather up all the coal that's in all the coal fields, there's about 10 times more coal than the plants that are alive today. So if you spread the amount of carbon being generated through 10 times more vegetation, even while it's still alive, there would be 1/10 the amount of carbon-14 in their body. Okay? That's like dividing things in half 3 times. And then you divide it in half 1 more time. If it was buried during the flood or shortly thereafter, it would have lived not 20,000 years ago, it would have lived 5,000 years ago because it started out with only this much carbon-14. Or, there's lots of reasons for understanding during the worldwide flood, the magnetic field of the Earth flipped back and forth rapidly. It greatly deteriorated the overall strength of the Earth's magnetic field. So way less radiation is being diverted today than was diverted before the flood. In other words, the world was much more of a paradise before than after the flood. Much less degeneration, much less radioactive carbon being built that our very bodies are being built from. So before the flood, there may have only been that much carbon-14. 5,000 years past, we're down to this much. It wasn't 20,000 years ago, it was 5,000 years ago those animals were buried. You get the picture? You leave the Bible out, you leave the flood out, you're guaranteed to misinterpret how old things were and what happened in the past. But there's an even bigger problem. Carbon-14 keeps disappearing. So that's 25,000 years, 30,000 years, 35,000 years, 40,000 years. No lab will ever report a date older than 40,000 years because everything they dig up still has this much carbon-14 in it. Dinosaur bones still have that much carbon-14 in it. Now, it's not that mean it's 40,000 years old. It just means that's how much is left today from what they started with. So if you keep dividing it, after 38 divisions, you get down to just a teeny little speck. Actually, I'm sorry, after 18 divisions, you're down to just a speck. After 38 divisions, there shouldn't be a single atom of carbon-14 left. And yet, we find like that much left in everything that's buried. Carbon-14 actually shows us things couldn't possibly be millions of years old because it's still there in all this stuff buried in the rock layers. So it's actually a very, very good friend when you understand how it works of a biblical framework and viewpoint. So, hope that helped. You're welcome. Any other questions? How do you float? Well, because our bodies are made of lots of solid stuff like bones and muscles, if we just lay in water and we breathe out the air, we're going to sink because we're heavier than water. So the best way to float is take a great big deep breath of air and then our lungs are filled with air. And then if we're moving across the water, we stay on the top surface. And that's the best way to float, is to keep pushing the water down and that pushes our body up and keep breathing lots of air. So you should practice that next time you're in the pool. Big breath of air and keep pushing the water down with your hands.
We talk a lot about the flood.
I do.
Do you think that Grand Canyon was formed from the flood?
Almost all the geologists, they believe it either formed during the flood as water rushed off the continents. And there's this, by the way, the mid-Atlantic ridge, the Earth cracked open. There's a 40,000 mile crack that goes all the way around the entire Earth. And all of the magma that poured out to form the ocean basins is acknowledged by everybody. It's much younger than the continental surfaces and the mountain ranges and so on. So as this magma poured out to form the new oceans, it was probably pushing the continents apart, really, really hot. As it cooled, it became denser and there would have been a sinking down process. And because the sedimentary rock is less dense, the entire continents would have started to buoy upward. And then the water would have rushed off of the entire continental surfaces. And it's like, imagine the entire sheets of water rushing across the entire continents. It's just dragging all sorts of sediment. But if you've ever observed like a raging creek in the mountain, it often comes down and it's not like, there's like sandbars and rubble bars. Water on the beach, if you pour it, it will form erosional ruts and it will follow whatever's the softest, weakest path. And they think the Grand Canyon was carved out mostly during the flood. And by the way, it's true of almost every drainage river valley in the world. The Nile drainage valley, the Amazon drainage valley, the Mississippi drainage valley, they formed by water rushing off the continents, leaving an enormous valley with a little river at the bottom. The river didn't form the valley. The flood formed the valley, leaving the river. Now there's other folks who think there was a dammed up lake. As the continents rose, it left lots of water in huge lakes. The ice from the Ice Age would dam up enormous areas. And as the ice melted, those huge lakes would get trapped behind unmelted ice. The Columbia River Valley that just cut all the way across Washington, the Columbia River, the scab lands of eastern Washington, that is now absolutely known to have been the result of water that melted, got backed up between ice during the Ice Age, the ice dam broke through, and the whole Columbia River Valley formed in a matter of days and weeks. So we had stuff forming during the flood, but there's also continued catastrophes after the flood that were ultimately caused by the flood.
So you say that the first law of thermodynamics is used to debunk evolution, that everything came from nothing. If that's the case, where was all the matter before God created the universe?
There was none. The Bible is really clear. God spoke and it came into existence. To try to force a Christian to come up with a naturalistic explanation for what God has told us was a supernatural cause outside of natural science is to try to get us to deny our very faith. And it is a faith. What I'm saying is, those who believe in evolution, their God is naturalism. It has to explain everything. And the very observations of science show they can't be right. It does not work. They revert back to faith. Those who are like, well, they're relying on string theory and quantum mechanics and the cosmic Big Bang. They have faith that the laws that we observe operating in the universe today didn't operate at the beginning of creation. There's no evidence for that. There's no science for that. There's no experiments for that. They just assume it's true. That's faith. It's two faiths. And I prefer to rely on the faith that supports what we can actually observe and see right in front of our faces. Fair enough? Okay.
Where's Noah's Ark?
Where is Noah's Ark? Good question. You ask 100 Christians and you'll get two completely different viewpoints, and there's usually just two. My wife is in the camp, as are many others, that would have been so valuable after the flood, where we're trying to eke out an existence in a world that's totally been devastated by the greatest catastrophe of all human history, that it would have just been picked apart and used for other habitations, and it's just gone. It's not around anymore. There's others who absolutely are convinced there's been enough seemingly credible observations that there is some boat either up on Mount Ararat or some close by mountain that's continually snow-covered, over 12,000 feet. The glaciers never melt, and that ark is still up there somewhere. I don't know which is true. I'm kind of intrigued by one possibility. And there's supposedly during World War II, there were Soviet planes that took pictures of it. Later on in the 40s and 50s, there's been exhibitions and people have found stuff, and supposedly it's wood from the ark. And because it's in Turkey, it's controlled by warring tribes and Muslims, and you're not allowed up there, and it's real hard to get up there. It's continually covered with glaciers that melt back some years more than other years. It's underneath the glaciers. The excuses are given that, it's still there, we just haven't found it. Let me just say this. I would not be surprised. Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the Son of Man returns. The eating and drinking and giving in marriage, just kind of life going on the way it was. Before God brought judgment on a totally corrupt mankind, and he did it in a way that they would understand their sin brought death, and the rock layers are filled with death that's a result of judgment upon us. There was an ark And biblically, Noah had lived a very long life. He had 100 years, and he's called a preacher of righteousness. So he's out there preaching and trying to bring repentance, and he had no converts in 100 years of preaching. But there's a symbol of impending judgment in front of all of humanity, this enormous ark. And it's got to be just total ridicule by the whole world of that day. I wouldn't be surprised if before Christ returns again, that ark is found. And again, there will be a symbol of total judgment of humanity at the top of a mountain, big enough to hold every species of mammal, reptile, and amphibian in the entire fossil and living record in only 30% of its space at the top of a mountain. As a symbol that, yeah, God judged sin once and he's going to judge it again. And he's going to wrap things up. So that wouldn't surprise me, but I have no proof of it. And there's just little hints, and I don't know who to believe, whether it's there or not. So, you know what I believe in? Because there's all sorts of evidence to support it, is the continental race. It's not a drift. During the flood, and by the way, ICR, if you go to ICR.org, there's an Institute for Creation Research, in their September newsletter, they have a phenomenal article by a man named John Baumgartner. Now, he spoke for Campus Crusade for Christ in the 1970s at Berkeley, California. He was there, trying to present Christianity to the students. One of the biggest contradictions or reasons to not believe the Bible coming from the students was that there is so much sedimentary rock on this planet. There is no way to explain how that could all have formed within a 1-year period of the flood, okay, or where the continents look the way they do. He took it upon himself to go get a PhD in geophysics, ended up working for the Sandia National Laboratory, and developed the world's most sophisticated computer model of how the continents move and why they move the way they do. Now today, the continents, and it's pretty much been proven, they sit upon these enormous, massive shelves of rock, hundreds of miles thick. But underneath them is this super thick magma. It's almost, you would think it was rock. It's so thick, okay? And they're moving, and they've been measured definitively to be moving. So the North American continental plate and the European continental plate are now about 2,000 miles apart, and they're moving about the width of your fingernail every year. So next year, Europe is going to be that much further away from America than it is this year, okay? And they use that to explain how the mountains were shoved up. The Rocky Mountains was the Pacific plate shoving into the North America plate, shoved up the Rocky Mountains. The Himalaya Mountains was when India is on a little continental plate, and it's shoved up into Asia, and it's shoved up the Himalaya Mountains. But the world's time frame, which they have to believe in evolution, is that those continents were moving at the same speed hundreds of millions of years ago as they were today. And you do the math, you find out it would take 100 to 200 million years for them to move into their current positions. And it does seem like the plates were kind of all together as one continental area early on at some point in Earth history. And that may very well be true. So yeah, I think it's absolutely accurate. Lots of evidence for it. But it's assumed they always moved at the same rate. That's an assumption. That's a presumption. What Dr. Baumgartner showed was it was becoming obvious in the 1980s and 1990s that this underlying magma increased orders of magnitude, like 1,000,000 times more thin once you get the continents moving. If they started to move rapidly, they would start to move incredibly rapidly as something called shear thinning happens with underlying magma. And he has shown this with computer modeling and experimentation and lab tests, and he's published it in scientific journals, that during the flood, what was very likely happening, now this is just a model, no one was there, but it shows all of the science lines up with it. The observation of or knowing what these rock layers do lines up with it. They wouldn't have been moving at just centimeters per year. The continents could have been moving at miles per hour, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 miles per hour, because the underlying sediment became so thin and so slick. Now here's the concept. If you have two continental plates coming together, like India coming up into Asia, and the next year they're a little closer, and the next year they're like that much closer, and the next year they're that much closer, and then India slams into Asia, it's not going to shove up 30,000 feet high this enormous amount of rubble. They're either going to come to a stop, or it's going to start to reverse direction. But now suppose you have two trains coming together, and they're moving at like 30 or 40 miles an hour, and those trains hit. What happens? You get a train wreck. Everything just heaps way up into the air. See, the very existence of the mountains to me shows it happened rapidly. It didn't just happen like they just bump and stop. It was a train wreck when the mountains of the earth formed. And it would have happened probably during months like 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 of the flood. The first few months, as those plates are starting to move, what you get is an earthquake zone running the length of the globe. You have an entire continental plate that's just moving forward, and then it slips forward, and it creates a tidal wave 1,000 feet deep that sweeps across the entire continent and pulverizes everything. That's where all the rubble came from to form 10,000 feet deep sedimentary layers of rock during the early parts of the flood. And then the mountains formed during the later stages of the flood. So yeah, continental drift was not continental drift, it was continental sprint. And it did happen, but biblically it happened very rapidly during the flood. So, hope that helps. All right, great questions. Most of this stuff, everything we just talked about are in those different books and the video series. So just be confident that God has given us the framework to know the truth. And by studying creation, we can fit all those details in, and it fits into the framework very, very well. So, thank you again. Oh, wait, tomorrow night, okay, if you can all get away, I'm going to fit all of the world cultures into a biblical time frame since the flood. Because the Egyptians, the Babylonians, they didn't exist before the flood. The pyramids are made out of sedimentary rock that formed during the flood. Those were built after the flood. And all of us have heard they're 10,000, 20,000 years old and so on. You know, the Egyptian pyramids were built 6,000, 8,000 years ago. Well, the flood was only 4,500 years ago. So how does all that work? So we're going to look at that plus these just phenomenal inventions of these different cultures. And it's a fun talk and a great way to wrap up our sessions. So thank you.
I do all that. We're going to have one more opportunity tomorrow. I encourage everyone that has people that you know need to hear this information. They are not going to hear this on the Disney Channel or the Discovery Channel. And Facebook is out. So invite you. Come back, bring questions. Look at the books that are in the back. I told Bruce, I've got 4 of his books, all back there. I call it part of my 6-pack. I read every day 1 page of that with evidence. So go back and look what's back there. Thank you very much for coming. There's snacks and goodies over here. Please eat it all or I will.
Thank you all.